It became evident that something was amiss in the house as soon as I found myself in my courtyard. Ambulances and police cars together, and in multiple, don't just show up for no reason. A crowd of perpetually indifferent pensioners had gathered near the entrance, shaking their heads in all directions, muttering, "What a horror." "What is happening?" I pushed my way through to the elevators. In the elevator lobby, a bored and grim police officer awaited me, blocking my path, and grumbled,
"From this building? Not a journalist?"
"No, not a journalist, just heading home."
"Then go up."
The elevator obediently stopped at my 8th floor, and I stepped out into the whirlwind of events. People with papers roamed the entire floor. Doctors stood nearby whispering quietly. Police officers appeared in the lobby and then disappeared up the stairs. Someone grabbed me by the shoulder.
"Where are you going?" "Apartment number?" Some official in a gray jacket hovered over me, ready to shove me back into the elevator. I jerked my arm away, turning.
31st. What's going on here?
"An incident occurred in your neighbor's apartment. It's a homicide. Please go to your apartment quickly and don't disturb anyone working."
I made my way to my door. A real crowd had gathered here. Someone was speaking loudly over a radio, and several people in strange canvas suits were maneuvering some equipment across the floor, resembling automotive vacuum cleaners. The door to the neighbor's apartment was wide open. I knew their hallway by heart. The long torn pieces of wallpaper on the wall caught my eye. I was literally guided to the entrance of my apartment, preventing me from looking around. I mechanically tore off the advertisement for a new pizzeria from the door, slipped inside, and closed the door behind me. In the silence of my apartment, the commotion subsided. It was only when I started pouring boiling water for tea that the tranquility of my apartment was shattered by the doorbell. On the other side of the door, a short man in a worn gray suit was waiting for me. I peered out and surveyed the landing. There were fewer people, but the doors of the 29th apartment remained wide open, and bags and rags were being carried out from there. The man in the jacket took out his identification from an inner pocket and said,
"Investigator Kromov, Special Department. I want to talk to you."
"Please."
"Thank you, but not in the hallway."
Before I could react, the man entered my hallway and closed the door behind him. A minute later, we were both sitting at the kitchen table. The investigator remained silent, studying me with his eyes, took out a dictaphone from his pocket, and then said,
"You should know there was a double homicide in the apartment across from yours. Quite gruesome. What can you say about the residents, former residents of this apartment?"
Quite the incident, what could I say? I knew them from a distance. We never interacted closely, just exchanged greetings when we met. A not-so-young married couple, Victor and Natalia, childless, had been living in this building even before I moved in. About once every 6 months, they'd make a ruckus. He loved watching football and shouting at the TV. She would bang cups and shout something. I'd borrowed tools from them a couple of times. Once I brought them a fridge magnet as a gift. In general, they were just ordinary neighbors. Nothing stood out about them. The investigator nodded boredly and continued,
"Have you seen any unfamiliar or strange people in the lobby?"
"I don't recall. But I'm almost always at work. I'm only here to sleep, so."
"I understand. Do you use food delivery services, maybe ordering pizza or sushi?"
The unexpected question threw me off. What did that have to do with anything? Well, I do sometimes, but not often. I try to eat at the office. We get discounts there. Kromov pointed at the pizzeria ad I'd discarded in the hallway, which he, for some reason, brought with him into the kitchen.
"And this? Do ad people wander around here often?"
Well, there's always plenty of spam. At least once a week, sometimes more. The investigator lost interest in the conversation and rose from the table.
"Thank you, that's all. Here, take this. It's my card with my contact details. I'll be handling the case, so if you notice or remember anything, even if it seems trivial, don't hesitate to call."
He was already heading towards the exit door. I processed what I had heard, staring blankly at the business card. The embossing Special Department shimmered silver in front of my eyes. Why special? Why is it called the Special Department? Kromov paused in the hallway and turned to me.
"Because regular departments investigate bicycle thefts and drunken antics. I don't want to scare you, but you'll find out anyway, whether from the newspapers or online. Someone disemboweled 2 adults just across from you. The forensic team didn't find all the remains, hence the Special Department."
I stood there paler than chalk, while the investigator observed with some grim satisfaction the effect of his words.
"You weren't home at the time. I've already checked with your superiors. Too bad. You might have heard or seen something. The neighbor opposite you is deaf, and next door lives some student who never takes off his headphones.
If you know the time, you could check the cameras.
You mean the cameras in the lobby? They installed them, yes, but never connected them. Someone will be fined or imprisoned for that now, but that doesn't make it any easier for us, does it? We don't know what the assailant looks like.
Kromov fell silent.
Keep an eye out for a while, agreed? You have my phone number?
Yes. And do you think he'll come back?
Who knows what's going on in his head, but if you notice. Even if you think you've noticed something, report it immediately.
The investigator left for the landing. I watched him until he reached the elevator and then locked the door, for the first time, on all the locks. The evening passed in doubt. I tried to occupy myself with something, but everything slipped from my hands. I couldn't even read books. I kept returning to that brief conversation with the investigator. Unsure of what to do with myself, I decided to go to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. After midnight, I tossed and turned in bed. Whenever I closed my eyes, I imagined cautious footsteps on the staircase landing. A couple of times, I timidly got out of bed, crept to the door, and peeked through the peephole, but the staircase was empty. How could I have worked myself up like this? Yes, there had been a monstrous murder in the neighbor's apartment, but why should I worry about it? I returned to bed, but 15 or 20 minutes later, I found myself making excuses to go check if someone was lurking near the doors. It wasn't until 3 in the morning that I finally fell asleep. And I woke up from my own coughing. My head hurt, and it felt like a hot coal was stuck in my throat. It was clear cold. It wasn't surprising half the office had runny noses, and the other half coughed like tuberculosis patients. I messaged the work chat that I needed 2 or 3 days off. Reluctantly, management agreed, reasoning that it was better for me to stay home than infect people. A bathrobe, warm slippers, a huge cup of tea, and there I was, half lying in front of the monitor. An hour later, my body demanded breakfast. I didn't feel like cooking, so I opened the food delivery app and quickly ordered myself breakfast, lunch, dinner, and even some snacks. 20 minutes later, the courier was already handing me heavy bags. He quickly bid me farewell and headed for the elevators, when I noticed this strange man on the staircase landing. A thin, short man, he recoiled from the courier and muttered something to himself. Then, completely ignoring me, he got down on all fours in front of the door of the apartment opposite mine, the same one where Victor and Natalia were killed, and pressed his ear to the floor. I stood there with the bag in my hand, unsure of what to do, while the city lunatic sniffed something, tasted it, crawled on the floor, and talked to himself. I ventured, "Hey, are you okay?" No reaction. As if he hadn't heard. "Hey, should I call an ambulance?" The man froze and slowly turned his head towards my voice, making me feel uneasy.
Call? Call, you say? They've already been called. And when they weren't called, they came themselves. They came, but they didn't leave. And now they won't leave.
He shouted the last phrase into the air, dancing in place. I backed away into my hallway. Come on. That's nonsense. Listen, I'm not from the ambulance. I'll call the police right now.
Call or don't call. They'll come by themselves. They won't come in the day. They'll come at night. They'll beg, all gentle and affectionate. But you mustn't let them across the threshold. You mustn't.
All right, got it. I didn't like this. I slammed the door shut and dialed the number from the card the investigator left. Kromov picked up on the third ring, patiently listened to me, and said that the operatives would arrive in 10 to 15 minutes. He asked me to keep an eye on the subject until then. I approached the door and looked through the peephole. The madman stood right in front of my door, staring at me intently with narrowed eyes. I recoiled from the door and shouted, "I've already called the patrol. Stop this immediately." From behind the door came a response.
Not those. Don't fear the living like I don't fear them. The dead walk here. Fear those who will ask first. Fear the talkative and the beautiful. Their traces are everywhere. They went everywhere, climbed everywhere, except the threshold. They can't cross the threshold unless invited. They can't cross the threshold unless requested. They're not allowed to walk, not allowed to eat flesh, not allowed to drink water.
I understood his ramblings less and less. Soon he spiraled into such nonsense that I didn't even bother trying to make sense of it. He sat on the floor, clutching his head, spinning around, hitting the locked door with his hands. At the noise, the neighbor across from me peeked out, squealed, and quickly retreated into her own apartment. To my relief, after a few minutes, several people in police uniforms actually appeared on the landing. They cornered the lunatic. Of course, he didn't have any documents with him. They led him out of the building, but the madman wouldn't calm down.
Look them in the eyes. Tell them you see them. Only then will you see clearly. Don't be dead. Be alive.
I didn't know where they took him, and I didn't want to know. Around lunchtime, the investigators sent a dry text message, "Thanks for your vigilance." But this is not what we were expecting, of course. It wasn't. The local loon had heard rumors in the courtyard and personally come to see. This fool was hardly dangerous, but I was grateful to the police for removing him from our building. After lunch, drowsiness overtook me. Sleep is beneficial when you're sick. I popped a couple of aspirin tablets into a glass, put my phone on silent mode, and went to the bedroom. I woke up late and completely worn out. The short February day had ended. The sun had long since set. I lay with my eyes closed, listening to my sensations. My throat hurt, my muscles and joints ached. I began to think that it would be a good idea to see a doctor. This felt too much like the flu. But most importantly, I couldn't quite articulate it. There was some vague unease gripping me. Something was off. Something was troubling me. Suddenly, the silence of the darkened apartment was shattered by the screech of the doorbell. I nearly jumped. It was so unexpected. With my heart pounding, I staggered to the hallway. Without looking, I swung open the door. Standing on the landing was a petite woman in a colorful terry cloth bathrobe.
Hello?
She smiled broadly.
Oh, nothing much. I'm just your new neighbor.
The woman waved her hand towards Victor's apartment. Oh, I see. My condolences. The woman immediately put on a mournful expression and leaned on my doorway.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Such a tragedy. Such a tragedy. No one left to remember. Won't you join me?
I'm feeling unwell. I have a cold.
Then all the more reason for you to drink a lot. Let's make some tea now. Come on, I'll help you.
The woman rambled on about which jam was the healthiest, insisting that tea must have lemon. I didn't interrupt, but moved further into the dark hallway and headed to the kitchen. My mind was foggy. I was having trouble thinking straight. I didn't like everything that was happening. This uninvited guest and her desire to help me. I had almost reached the kitchen, turning on the light along the way, when I realized I was alone. The woman was still standing on the landing. And then a phrase thrown by the madman flashed in my mind: "They can't cross the threshold unless invited." I slowly turned back. It seemed like everything was written on my face. The woman in the bathrobe cheerfully squeaked.
Why are you looking at me so strangely? You should have invited the lady to come in.
I invited you. This strange neighbor seemed unable to stand still. She seemed to be dancing all the time, her hands constantly searching, her fingers fidgeting. But her eyes were the complete opposite: unpleasant, piercing, scrutinizing gaze that slid over me incessantly, making me uncomfortable. I strained my memory. The lunatic shouted that I had to say something. I summoned my willpower, took a deep breath, and staring firmly into the stranger's eyes, said, "I see you." I waited for this cheerful neighbor to burst into laughter, freeze in confusion, or erupt into a new tirade like, "Of course you see me. I'm right in front of you." Eventually, she'd probably decide that I was crazy and quickly leave. But what happened exceeded all my expectations. The smile was wiped off her face as if by a gust of wind before my eyes. Her hands started elongating and thinning, while her torso swelled and grew in size. I stood in the middle of the hallway, unable to move, as the unknown creature swayed on the landing in front of my door. Soon she was it. Even her last human features: pale, hairless skin, a large bumpy head, a frog-like mouth with disgustingly moving lips, thin long limbs with twisted joints, huge eyes. The creature realized that the deception was revealed and changed tactics. I felt a powerful intervention of someone else's will. My legs took one tiny step toward the exit, then another. No, I grabbed onto the shoe rack and toppled it in front of me. The monster whispered from behind the threshold, "Say come in. Say come in. It will all end. Just say it with all my strength." I barked out, "Get out." The creature recoiled for a moment, enough for me to release my front door. The door closer did its job, thanks to you, inventor of door closers. And thank me too, for splurging on it once upon a time, and my apartment door slammed shut, separating me from the monster. I instantly felt relieved. I locked the door. There were several bangs on the door from outside. Then everything fell silent. With trembling hands, I dialed the investigator. It took me 4 attempts. Despite the late hour, Kromov answered almost instantly. 20 minutes later, he and one of his operatives were sitting in my kitchen. I recounted the story on a recorder, for the record, and the investigator listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long silence in the kitchen. Kromov turned off the recorder, rubbed his temple, and without looking at me, said,
"So, what's your temperature, did you say?"
"I understand everything." And I exploded. "What does it matter?" I saw that creature, do you understand? My life was threatened by who knows what. Listen, this is probably what killed my neighbors. The investigator and the operative got up from the table.
No, you listen. I was hoping that you were a reasonable adult whose observations, who knows, might be useful. And you. First you turn in some sorry drunk who cried for a sober up. Now, you think it's funny to drag the special department staff and tell them fairy tales.
These aren't fairy tales. A woman came. She said she now lives in that apartment. It hides in the form of a neighbor from across the hall. Kromov paused.
A neighbor? The deceased couple were childless. Their closest relatives I've been in touch won't arrive until 2 days later. The keys to the apartment are securely held. No one can be there.
We all went out onto the landing. The operative tried the door handle. Locked. The investigator himself rang the doorbell several times. Silence. They knocked on the door several times, still nothing. Kromov turned to me with a bored expression.
Just as I thought. Get some rest, drink more water, and think twice next time before pulling people away from their work.
The two of them trudged heavily down the stairs. I stood on the landing for a while, then rushed into my apartment and locked the door with all the bolts. I sincerely wanted Kromov to be right. Oh, if only it were some painful delusion, a bad dream, the effects of a fever, anything but reality. In reality, this doesn't happen. It can't happen. I sat on the floor in the hallway, pressing the back of my head against the cold metal of the front door. For a while, nothing happened. I almost calmed down. It was quiet on the landing. As soon as I told myself that nothing terrible had happened, the doorbell rang again. I jumped in place. This time I didn't rush to open the door as usual and look through the peephole. Standing in front of the door was a short Asian guy in the delivery service's uniform. I asked, "Who's there?" "Que?"
Hello, you ordered food from us this morning.
I did.
There was a mistake. You weren't delivered everything. I have the missing items and a gift from the store with me. That was a lie. Actually, everything I ordered was delivered in the morning. I felt a shiver running through me. Apparently, they were counting on my greed. There are those who can't resist the word gift. Let me in, or the groceries will thaw.
Let him in. After what I've been through, not a chance. No, I got everything delivered this morning.
Then accept the gift as an apology for the inconvenience.
Indeed, the guy had a slick tongue. No. You know what? I don't need it. I refuse. The delivery guy shuffled around near my door and moved to the door opposite, to the neighbors. I froze at the door. He rang the doorbell. Someone answered from inside the apartment. Don't be stupid, don't open the door. But like in a nightmare, the matte fabric of the iron door of the opposite apartment slowly slid aside, and my neighbor stood on the threshold. I stared, spellbound, as she discussed something with the stranger. Suddenly, he threw his bag over his shoulder and stepped forward. Without thinking, I unlocked the latch and, swinging open my door, shouted, "No, stop." But before my ears, I heard the neighbor's words. "Oh, of course. Come in." The delivery guy slowly turned his head toward me with a crunch. His body remained motionless. The neighbor squealed, looking at the approaching back of his head. Mocking yellow eyes stared straight at me. His smile widened, revealing a row of thin, crooked teeth, and meanwhile, his legs stepped over the threshold into the apartment. From the open doors of the neighboring apartment, there were screams of women for a while, but it quickly subsided and turned into some guttural gurgling and sobbing. Pressing my fingers against the smartphone screen, I dialed the investigator again. Kromov didn't pick up for a long time. Each ring felt like an eternity. I barely remember what exactly I shouted. I only remember how he said, "Close the door and don't approach the killer. Close the door." That's an idea. I didn't expect it from myself. My legs dashed to the kitchen. I grabbed a chair, then dashed onto the landing, slammed shut the door to the apartment opposite, propped the door handle with the chair, and as the door closer was closing my door, I managed to dart back inside. Peering through the door peephole, I watched with some bewildered satisfaction as the door jerked a couple of times, as someone pulled the handle from the inside but couldn't open the door. In my head, the thought kept swirling, the neighbor was beyond saving already. Kromov stood on the landing, looking at the door propped up with a chair. I stepped out too.
Did you do this?
Yes. That creature is inside. The operative snickered. This time there were two of them, and the investigator frowned.
Again. Do you understand that this time I'll bring you in for a false alarm at the very least?
I remained silent, removing the chair. The door turned out to be unlocked. The operatives entered the hallway, greeted by a hysterical female voice.
Finally. I thought you'd never come.
Kromov squeezed forward.
What's going on here?
What do you mean, what? Didn't you see it? This lunatic wouldn't let me leave the house. I had to prop the door with this chair.
The neighbor, almost jumping in place, waved her hands in my direction. The investigator frowned and turned to me.
So this is serious. This isn't just a false alarm, this is vandalism at the very least.
I could swear my neighbor was darting around the room. What about the screams? What happened to the delivery guy? And then I understood everything. I knew what to do. Looking into the woman's eyes, I confidently and firmly said, "I see you." Why? One of the operatives already had his hand on my shoulder. The other was writing something. Kromov managed to say,
What are you even talking about?
but the neighbor stopped dead in her tracks. The investigator turned to the woman and froze mid-sentence. I had seen this creature before, but that didn't make me any less afraid. In the middle of the room, a pale white body swayed, the size of a young bear, on thin legs like stilts. Yellow eyes scanned the room. Kromov stood closer than anyone else. As if in slow motion, I watched as the lumpy head lowered onto his shoulder, and with a nauseating crunch, the jaws closed when the creature straightened up. The investigator was missing part of his neck. Fragments of flesh protruded from the tattered collarbone. Everything buzzed and swayed. I barely remember how I ended up on the landing in one leap. I crossed the threshold of my own apartment. I was stunned by a gunshot, then another one. After a brief struggle in the neighboring apartment, both operatives burst out of the doors. The first one, without hesitation, rushed into my hallway, while the second hesitated, looking back. That's what got him killed. A brief blow knocked him off his feet. The monster, swaying, emerged from the doors. The metamorphosis was almost complete. The creature was trying to regain its former form. For the rest of my days, the image of a short, elderly woman in bloody rags with a gunshot wound to the stomach and a hole in her forehead dragging by the legs a writhing, shouting giant man will remain before my eyes, dragging towards the door. Into the darkness. The smile on the contorted pale face grew wider. Again, the landing was crowded with people. Doctors, policemen, and others. I sat on a folding chair on the landing. They were saying something to me, asking something. I didn't even try to pretend that I understood. Last night, when the surviving operative stopped shaking and spoke on the phone for half an hour, the door to the neighboring apartment opened before our eyes, and as if nothing had happened, Kromov came out. He passed by my door, winking at both of us with yellowed eyes, and slowly went down the stairs. The lone operative didn't dare to enter the crime scene. Reinforcements arrived an hour later and turned everything upside down. They found bodies. Or rather, many body parts. They found casings. I didn't care. I didn't know who I could trust anymore, because this monster could take anyone's form. Who delivers your pizza? Who brings sushi? Who fixes the plumbing or assembles furniture? There was only one thing keeping my consciousness afloat. I knew I would never again utter the words, "Come in, please."